everyone, this is Greyshot151 here, and today we are going over the final part of what if Austria joined the Crimean War. So let's jump right into it, shall we? So as we left off, 1915 came to a close. The Austrian army was crippled by a German offensive which captured Vienna. The French moved through Belgium, pushing the Germans across the Rhine and causing the British to enter the war on the side of Germany, while Balkan forces took Constantinople and nearly exit the Caucasus mountain range. The armies hold during winter and await the thaw of spring. As it arrives, conflict once again roars to life. 1960 for Germany would be a defensive period, even with the British in support. While well stocked, their border against France, Austria, and Russia would push their manpower to their absolute limit. To put in perspective, a mobilized Russia and Romanian reinforcements in Austria would make it so any front would have nearly 2 to 3 times the amount of troops as the Germans. New emphasis would be made on the Western Front to claim rightful German territory, but an offensive would need time to build, manpower to gather, allowing the French to dig in and make any minor engagement indecisive at best. Britain over the course of the year would send troops to Germany's Western Front, but relations between the two would remain tense to say the least. The war at the sea would be to Britain's favor, with the exception of French submarines proving disastrous for English shipping in the Atlantic, and Mediterranean being patrolled by Austrian and French surface vessels. Canada, Austria, and Indian troops would arrive in support, assisting the German and Ottomans on their own respective fronts. Joining the war on the side of Britain, Japan would focus on the European assets in the Pacific, Indochina, the French and Austrian free cities in China. These would be quickly secured by the Japanese, while very little focus would be placed on Russia. The Japanese would be very against marching into Russia for fear of repeating the Russo-Japanese War. Therefore, a kind of unspoken non-aggression pact forms between Japan and Russia. Troops are placed on the border, but no real engagements are made for fear of the loss of Japanese life, placating the civilian and military as they acquire better assets throughout the Pacific. This may infuriate the British and the Germans, but their opposition would be minimal as the Japanese, in essence, garrison the entirety of the Pacific. What about the European Entente? Well, France, Austria, and Russia know they can't meet the British in the open sea with their fleets, so the Mediterranean would be the top priority. The French and Austrian home fleets would sail the sea, striking any British shipping vessel that may come across and allowing troops and supplies to be ferried with minimal risk from Africa to Europe. Malta and Cyprus would be put under immense pressure, which would only build as the British grasp of the sea weakens over time. Meanwhile, with the Ottoman offensive grinding to a halt due to low supplies, and the threat of Germany increasing, Nicholas II, I believe, would primarily focus on Germany now, realizing the grave threat that the nation poses to his as well as his entire alliance. Reinforcements would begin to flood to Germany's eastern border, while more men moved to stop the Swedish advance. Wishing to reclaim lost territory, Austria would also plan its offensive with whatever forces it has, coupled with Romanian support, while the Russian plans on an eastern push. France, on the other hand, wouldn't join this offensive on the grand scale, instead opting to dig in along the Rhine and move for more minor engagements. Why? Well, politicians, prime ministers, and the people would be celebrating the capture of Alsace-Lorraine, even as some criticized the fact that they had to push through Belgium to do so. An offensive could risk this acquisition, and no politician or general would dare risk territory which acted as the casus belli of the entire war. So in late 1916, the Russians and Austrians launched their offensive against the Germans, only to meet meager success. The Austrian offensive would crumble under its own weight, having little strength after Germany's knockout punch in 1915. Russia, on the other hand, would advance into Germany, taking East Prussia, but unable to advance any further due to fierce resistance. Reinforcements from the west would ensure this and begin a bloody battle as men would be thrown into a meat grinder over the Battle of Danzig. Major German generals like Paul von Hindenburg would be petrified of a major French assault with their manpower stretched so far, but as 1916 comes to a close, their worries begin to fade. Other events at the close of 1916 would be the Swedish advance into Finland, taking the north half of the country, Greek/Bulgarian troops crossing the Bosphorus Strait thanks to Greek inhabitants of Anatolia, and Japan's final conquest of all European alliance territory in the Pacific. Lastly, the French slowly being driven back as British supplies and troops push into northern Africa. As 1917 comes and brings with it a stalemate on most fronts, the size of the armies begins to matter less as supply and morale play a more important role. For the European alliance, gone are the days of the capture of Alsace-Lorraine and Constantinople. The public of France, Russia, and Austria would begin to show signs of fatigue and restlessness, with Austria and Russia showing cracks far more so than France. Germany and Ottoman morale, on the other hand, would be at its highest, as soldiers fight to defend their homeland from foreign aggression. On the flip side, the British would be suffering more so logistically than in our own World War I from French submarines, but I doubt the French would enact unrestricted warfare. The shadow of Belgium would be haunting their actions on the diplomatic stage, and bringing the United States into the war would not bode well. Either way, food and war supplies would reach both sides as the US acts as a neutral trading partner, with a definite lean in this case toward the British and the Germans due to its native population. On the Central Power side, men would die by the thousands on every front. Sweden would still advance with British support, Germany would be reluctant to commit any major offensive for fear of overextension, and the Ottoman front would turn into a two-front war of attrition. To break up the gridlock, Lord of the Admiralty, a young Winston Churchill, would recommend a daring naval engagement to end Austrian-French naval dominance in the Mediterranean and cut off France from its supplies in Africa. With their fleet mainly docked, Germany would join the naval engagement and move with Britain to the Mediterranean. However, the French would be prepared. French submarines and recon would spot the vessels moving south, allowing the French and Austrian navies to prepare in advance. As the Central Powers fleet moves past Gibraltar, they quickly discover the Austrian and French fleet waiting in ambush. Heavy metal rains down on both sides, but as the day progresses, the advantage gradually falls to the British and German vessels which remain. By the day's end, both fleets suffer crippling losses, far more so than any expected, but the British managed to open the gates to the Mediterranean. With the victory, 1917 fades into memory for both sides. 1918 begins with a fracture. The people of Russia, even if a war never occurred, would have rebelled against their government. World War I in our timeline acted as the springboard for such an action, from the lack of resources to the public, rising debt, and the loss of life. In this timeline, the coals are alight, but there is no spark yet. The Russians have lost men, but technically they have foreign territory. Supplies can flow from France to Russia, alleviating some of the worst cases of starvation in our own timeline. But tension would be there, growing. Demonstrations, riots, protests, these would make their way to the Tsar, and Nicholas II wouldn't be able to ignore it forever. He'd organize an offensive, removing excess men from all fronts and place them in the German front to finally end the war and establish Russian prestige. Unlike the last time, the French would have to join. Germany would notice the increase in buildup, but they would need to gamble with their reserves on which front to fortify. With the French having not launched a major offensive since 1915, the Germans would send their reserves to the west, allowing the British to fortify the east with any spare division they can muster. As June arrives, the offensive is launched. In the span of weeks, French and Russian forces crash into the German lines. In the west, German and British troops hold desperately against the main thrust of the French, a drive on the flat plains of Essen. Bridgeheads are made, but no considerable advance is created. On the east, the Danzig line falls. Russian troops focus on the land gap between Danzig and Posen, suffering immense casualties but forcing the Germans back mile by mile due to sheer numbers. In a month, the Viola River is completely taken on both sides, and the Posen appears in danger of being overrun. But the Russian advance creeps to a halt. Supplies and men can't keep up, giving the Germans time to reorganize with needed men from the west and launch their own counterattack. Exhausted Russian men are shocked by the assault, shattering their morale and forcing a general surrender, very much in line with the Battle of Tannenbaum. This would prove the furthest advance of 1918, if not for the one about to start in the south. Remember Italy? No? Well, they stayed neutral with their close relations to France and their geographic isolation compared to the European Entente. With the offensive proving disastrous for the European alliance and British supply lines now secure in the Mediterranean, Italy would feel the time is right to claim what she wanted. There would be no 12 battles of Caporetto, only one, and Italy would win this time against a demoralized, unfortified army. Italian ships would also prove the turning point on the sea, giving the Central Powers full access to the Mediterranean and jeopardizing the European alliance's eastern front in the Ottoman Empire, forcing a full withdrawal. With their success fading before their eyes, Austria and Russia would go to the negotiating table as uprisings occur across their land. Balkan forces would follow suit, but France, feeling betrayed and wishing to hold on to the territory it so rightfully deserved in its eyes, would try to negotiate another peace. German and British forces would settle this dispute with an advance in spring 1919, dislodging the French in Germany and Belgium and forcing them to the negotiating table, ending the Great Russian War. So what would this peace be like? Well, for the Germans, Wilhelm II would ensure African territory, at first given away by Bismarck, is given back to Germany, and then some. Russian territory with a German populace would be seated in Poland, far smaller than in our own timeline, and made up of Austrian and Russian territory, would form along its border. I doubt further territory would be annexed, as British fears of a powerful Germany would be ever present during the negotiations. Britain would absorb some of the French colonies, but it would most likely use its influence in the war to try and ensure stability in Europe and garner new allies, giving Italy far more land, ensuring France lost none of its core territory, and the establishment of a large Hungary would be some steps toward this goal. For the other Central Powers, Sweden would gain a large swath of territory in the north, allowing a free Finland to form at its border as a buffer to Russia. Since China was neutral, Japan would gain most of the territory that it garrisoned in the Pacific theater. This would be the free cities in China, this would include Indochina, and a whole swath of Pacific islands. For the Entente, things would be very dire, even in peace. The worst off would be Austria, who would be broken and divided amongst its nationalities, with Hungary, Serbia, Czechoslovakia, and Poland walking away with the largest slices of Austria pie. France and Russia would both descend into political chaos, quickly diving into civil wars following their defeat. Who would win these civil wars? I can't say definitively. I'd lean more socialist, considering the Germans, if they were to support a center or far-right side, would immediately gain the hatred of the French and Russian populations. Final things to say about all this? I actually think the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire would remain in power, and the Ottoman Empire itself would actually remain unified. That is actually unlike Wilhelm II, who I think's days would be numbered. Even a victorious Germany wouldn't be immune to the changing times. Do I see a democracy springing forth? No. But reforms and more rights for its people would gradually come forth. On America, I can't say much would change with Austria's new direction. Mexican-American War, Civil War, Spanish War, all of these events are removed from the European stage, but in this case, by not joining the world in war, it would just be a continuation of American isolationism, possibly setting a precedent when the next conflict eventually arises. To sum up everything, what would happen if Austria joined the Crimean War? Well, for Austria, a century of instability, tension, conflict, and loss, from one man making the worst decision of his life 60 years before he did so in our own timeline. But that is what if Austria joined the Crimean War. If you guys really enjoyed this, I might come back for a part 4 in the far future, but I have some awesome ideas, and I'm going to be working on those shorter one-parters. Until then, this is Greyshot151, and I will see you all next time.
Hello everyone, before you guys go, I want to tell you about these incredible people like Milam, Ace, Chris Bailey, Folkvard, Javibuxi, Jfoe, Joey G240, Josh, jrchicklis, JustThomasPlays, Little Koosh, Mustaach, Onlyplayapples, Pyroshark, Rilfe, Streakingwookie, WhiteHotD, GTA, Jakub Ocwieja, Nathan Angus, and Cedarteal. Thank you guys so much for your incredible Patreon support. This has been Greyshot17 and his amazing patrons, and I'll see you guys next time.